Hey, deserving listeners, I'm going to continue reviewing the story of Who the Fuck Did I Marry? Videos on TikTok made by Teresa Johnson. My name is Dr. Kirk Hanna. I'm a therapist and a professor. Let's review more of the story. She told him to get out of the house before she killed him. He was so lazy that he laid in the room using Powerade bottles to use the restroom. She said she was disgusted but didn't care. She wanted him gone. She changed the locks and the alarm. Yeah. So another hallmark of psychopathy is what we call a parasitic lifestyle. Actually, let's look at the full list here. Okay, so this is my list that I use for my own purposes. I am pulling this from a lot of the research and the consensus around psychopathic personality. And a lot of this is from the Hare measure and the Hare conceptualization. I won't go into that right now, but just know that I didn't invent these phrases, but I am organizing them in the way that helps me to conceptualize it and to remember it. So with the first category of symptoms, I'm titling it lack of empathy. This is, to me, the hallmark and the foundation of psychopathy. It's not the foundation for everyone in my field. They wouldn't see it that way necessarily, but many would. And the qualities, the characteristics, behaviors that are underneath this umbrella are callousness, meaning that they will harm others and seemingly just not care. They'll be harsh with others. It's like no big deal to them. It's like they're just walking down the street and they step on an ant and that's you and they don't care. Callous. Lack of remorse or guilt. It's obviously understood by the phrase. Failure to accept responsibility for their own actions. So I haven't really been highlighting that aspect, but that is something that they will do. They will be caught red-handed several times. It would even serve them. It would be smart for them to acknowledge that they indeed did do that thing, that they did lie. If they were smart, like the way Hollywood would portray them, there would be times when they'd be, you're right, I did lie about that. Now, they're not necessarily not doing that, but it's really hard for them to do that because of the pattern that they've built over their life. And they'll shoot themselves in the foot by lying incessantly, pathologically, even for unknown reasons. It doesn't even necessarily benefit them. And then when they're caught, they won't take responsibility. Not all of them, but they often will. Manipulative and cunning. So I have this under lack of empathy because they just don't care about manipulating others. Some could argue manipulative and cunning is in a different category, but I'm including it all in one category. Pathological lying and glib and superficial charm, meaning that they will be very charming, but it will be fake. And sometimes it's very noticeably fake, and sometimes it is not. It just depends. So the next category, the next umbrella, is narcissism. So as you can see, there's only two descriptors underneath here, meaning that it's not as central as lack of empathy, but it is a hallmark. And not every psychopath will exhibit this, but many of them will. And this is different than narcissistic personality disorder. It's more of a general personality trait in that they feel superior and they have a grandiose estimation of self. It's not often related to narcissistic personality. I won't go into that right now, but just know that there's some very complicated constructs that we're dealing with right now. The third umbrella that I categorize is shallow affect, so superficial emotional responses, meaning that they don't show the depth of emotion that you would expect. Like if someone had died, like in that account that she was giving that his grandma died, they will say that their grandma died, and they might come up with some tears, but it'll lack, well, that's not a good example because he's lying, and so he wouldn't have natural emotion. Let's say the grandma really did die. And let's say that he was attached to his grandma to some extent. The display, the response, the emotional affect, the way it looks when they have the emotion will be very shallow, meaning that it is not very deep. They'll be like, yeah, it was sort of sad. They'll exhibit a bit of sadness, but there won't be much there. And it's everywhere. There's happiness, that they don't get very happy. They don't feel a lot of joy. Now, they will display a lot of anger, which I think I'll get to in a second. That's another aspect. Now, what some people will mistake this for is that they don't have emotions, but that's not the case. And Hollywood will often depict this, but that's not usually the case. They might have very subdued emotions. They might have very limited access to their emotions, but I don't know. We'll listen to my eventual deep dive. Number 4 is irresponsibility. So this is that parasitic lifestyle that I was referring to, meaning that what we heard from Teresa about Legion is that he just laid around the house and parasited off of her. And now we're hearing that he paid for bills. So I am curious as to where that money came from and how that fits into the grand scheme of things. But in all likelihood, what he was gaming for was to eventually become a parasite. Like he was still in the process of proving himself to her. And I didn't hear a turning point for that. But I would assume that because psychopaths, they almost always want to get to that place where they're just completely without any sort of responsibility and someone else is doing all the work. Their spouse is working 3 jobs, they're cleaning the house, they're taking care of the kids, and the psychopath is just doing whatever they want and acting kind of like a child, which is interesting to think as to where this might come from, right? Which I'll get into in my deep dive. Another part of irresponsibility is a lack of realistic long-term goals. I've already been over this to some extent, but this is, I think, broader than what I was talking about in that their goals will be like, even internally, they'll have a goal that they're going to have all these grandiose goals, like I'm going to be President of the United States or I'm going to be a rock star, when it's not realistic that those things will happen. Impulsivity. So this is very important. It's not really in the category of irresponsibility, but it leads to irresponsibility. Arguable that this could be in its own category now that I'm looking at it, but they will act impulsively. They will lie impulsively. They will become violent impulsively. They will become sexual impulsively. They will buy things impulsively. They will move out of town impulsively. They will exploit someone impulsively. There's just like, they have a want and they just do it. It's very, very hard for them to control that. And when I work with psychopaths or antisocial people who are actually looking for help to some extent, this is a big thing that we work on because this shoots them in the foot so often. Poor impulse control, it's basically the same. I don't know why I have both of these. And criminal versatility. So I have that underneath this whole thing because, as I was talking about in an earlier video, I think that they will show this pattern of crimes in a variety of different contexts, like stealing and assaults and sexual assaults, and I'm just trying to think the sort of clients I would work with. Petty crime and big money crime and forging checks and stealing from the register at work and selling something that isn't really theirs. I'm sort of sticking to one kind of category of like money fraud, but I hope you get my point, that they will have crimes in a variety of circumstances, and they often are in prison. Not every psychopath will exhibit this, though. Some of them will have a line that they just don't cross when it comes to crimes, but a very common profile is someone that is in prison. A lot of what we know about psychopaths is having studied them in prison, because they often end up in prison. A large percentage, a very disproportionate percentage of people in prison have been found to suffer from psychopathy. I don't know the exact percentage off the top of my head, but say in the general population you have like 1% of people would qualify for the diagnosis. And in prison, I think certain research studies will find like 20 or 30% of the prison population qualifies for the disorder, meaning that if you have the disorder, you're very likely to end up in long-term prison sentences, because of the impulsivity, because of the exploiting others, because of the lack of having realistic long-time goals, because of your parasitic lifestyle and your irresponsibility. You don't have funds, so when you need money, you just exploit money out of other people. You never stop and think, well, maybe I could make my life easier by just having a job and having a career. And then I won't have to worry about my bills, and then I can exploit people in other ways. If someone was really trying and they were like the Hollywood psychopaths, that would be an option, but you don't usually see that. It's just shooting yourself in the foot, just one step in front of the other, following their nose, not thinking about the future, and you end up in prison, blah, blah, blah. Anyway, the number 5 here is need for stimulation. So I haven't really been going into this. It's not always the case, but it is common for many psychopaths that they have a need for stimulation. Sexual promiscuity, they will, not that being promiscuous is a sign of being a psychopath, but you will often hear that they will have a lot of impulsive and frequent motivation for sex. Not always, but they can. And just general poor behavioral controls. You consider this to be part of impulsivity and irresponsibility, but they will want something and they can't control themselves to take the time to get it in a way that doesn't get them in trouble because they just want that stimulation. They want that action. Sometimes they're even running on the adrenaline of the lie. And the last is early behavioral problems, juvenile delinquency, meaning that often for psychopaths, you will hear, if you have access to that data, the individual will have a track record of causing a lot of problems because the problem didn't just emerge when they were an adult. They've always had that tendency. Often they might, if they get evaluated, they might be diagnosed with conduct disorder or oppositional defiant disorder. Sometimes they'll get diagnosed with other things like ADHD, even though they don't have it, because it kind of looks like that. It can. And a lot of people will get labeled with that don't actually have it. A lot of people who have it don't get the label as well, but that's probably more the case. But anyway, I talked earlier about fire starting and other kinds of behavior, violence, lying, right? So you'll see that, and delinquency meaning that they'll end up being suspended or expelled from school, or they'll end up in trouble with the criminal justice system in certain ways. So that's referring to that. Not always. Certainly, I've met psychopaths that didn't have really any of these, or especially these two. The rest of them are pretty central, though. The irresponsibility, the shallow affect, the narcissism, and the lack of empathy, those are all pretty much, in my anecdotal experience, present with these individuals. So I wanted to show you this to know what the disorder is. Diagnosing this disorder is a bit complicated because it's not technically in the DSM. In the DSM, we have antisocial personality disorder, which is less specific, but it does have this. It does have lack of empathy, and it does have the irresponsibility aspect. But I wanted to let you in on how we see this disorder, how we define it. Generally speaking, this is the consensus. So getting back to the summary on Reddit, it says he ended up calling his aunt, and she Teresa was saying he was so lazy that he laid in the room using Powerade bottles to use the restroom. So another thing to think about is the possibility that he was depressed. And I know some people might say, oh, you can't be compassionate towards him. Just labeling something what it is isn't necessarily being compassionate. Psychopaths can be depressed, and if I remember right, there's a higher comorbidity of depression with psychopathy for various reasons. One is a lot of people who are diagnosed with psychopathy as adults went through tremendous trauma growing up, which can result in a lot of problems, including what seems to be at least the triggering of psychopathic personality and depression, PTSD. There's a lot of different things that can come from that. These individuals are very unlikely to go to therapy, or even ask for help, so they will suffer even more because of that overall. Also, as I've been talking about, their lives are train wrecks, and they know it, and they don't like it. And it can be very demoralizing and very depressing to them. So when I hear about someone who isn't even getting up to go to the bathroom and is just peeing in a Powerade bottle, I would explore depression first. I wouldn't think that's necessarily a part of psychopathy. At least that would be my initial assumption. It could also just be his way, or he was psychopathically trying to bother Teresa. I don't know. One of his cousins found her number and called her to ask what happened between them. He claimed he caught her cheating with a police officer. Oh, so Legion claimed that Legion caught Teresa cheating with a police officer and told the cousin. And the police threatened to shoot him if he didn't leave. But the cousin says he lies so much they didn't believe him. Okay, well, that's interesting. Okay, so I just want to chime in here and tell you that this is the end of the free portion of this video. If you want to see the full video, become a member of this YouTube channel by clicking the join button below. And everyone out there, please take care of yourself because you deserve it. You really, really do.